I'd like to welcome you all, of course, to this debate. We have two remarkable speakers. I think all of us know John Weidenbaum, who is a professor of philosophy and religion and ethics. I'm glad to have him here, and I'm very glad to meet you, Zevi. I've heard so much about you, so I'm very anxious and eager for this talk.
As I approach 20 minutes, Omar, tell me and I'll speed it up, okay? And then at some point, we're going to open it up for the room to direct questions at both of us. Okay. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to present, a lot of people are wondering, what the hell is a perennial philosophy anyway? I'm going to present this just to show I'm not arguing against a straw man, okay? Maybe later on I'll make the straw man. And then when I'm done, Zevi will then deliver his unique version of this kind of philosophy. And then I'll direct some questions to him, and then we'll open it up to the room. Okay. All right. What is the perennial philosophy? Religions seem, at least on the surface, to proclaim different things. Some believe in an all-powerful creator God, some do not. Some propose reincarnation, others do not. Some believe in one or more incarnations of a deity, a God who takes on flesh, and for others, such an idea is the height of blasphemy. Looking over the world's religions, major and minor, one finds a day of judgment, a law of karma, invisible savior beings, differing notions of the human self or soul, cyclical views of time versus linear views of history, and the list goes on and on. When encountering the different religions of the world, any reflective human being asks themselves some fundamental questions. These include, how can I know which religions connect with truth and which do not? Can all religions be true, each in their own way? Do all religions point to the same ultimate reality, or do their differences go all the way down? One popular attempt to answer this question is called the perennial philosophy, or perennialism. This perspective is held by a large number of thoughtful and spiritually inclined individuals, even by those who have never heard of the school of religious thought. Perennialism argues religions are undoubtedly different on the surface. Their rites, rituals, narratives, and beliefs are distinctive. Buddhism is not Islam. Christianity is not Sikhism. Now, each of the major religions of the world possesses a meditative or a mystical tradition. For instance, Islam has Sufism, Judaism, the Kabbalah, etc. While the outward elements of the major religions are different, their mystical traditions all converge upon the same metaphysical insight. This single metaphysical insight may be succinctly unpacked as such. A, the universe we perceive all around us is the expression of a single and eternal transcendental ground, a divine reality. B, our deepest self, our soul, Atman, holy neshama, etc., is already part of this divine reality. This fact has been eclipsed by the attachments and neuroses of our smaller selves, our egos. C, the goal of our spiritual lives is to realize this unity between our deepest selves and the divine ground. Perhaps the most eloquent summary of these principles is found right at the very beginning of Aldous Huxley's much beloved The Perennial Philosophy. The Perennial Philosophy, writes Huxley, is, quote, the metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with divine reality, the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. Perennial, unquote. Perennialism is also espoused by a group of religious thinkers known as the traditionalists. The most recognizable of these writers is the major figure in religious studies in the United States, Houston Smith. To the above principles, the traditionalists add the importance of initiation into a specific religious and mystical lineage. They are also deeply critical of many of the innovations and tendencies of a late modern world, including natural selection, Freudian psychology, postmodern tendencies in Western thought, etc. Arguably, the central figure of the traditionalists is the Swiss theologian Fritjof Schoen, whose name I might be mutilating, author of many volumes, most notably The Transcendent Unity of Religions. From Schoen's writing, we find a distinction that most readily summarizes what perennialism is. The outward or exoteric level of religions is comprised by their distinctive beliefs, narratives, and rituals, while the deeper esoteric level of religions all cohere upon the identification of our soul with the absolute. A memorable image from the Transcendent Unity of Religions captures the perennialist understanding of the relationship of the ultimate reality to the different religions, East and West. that of pure, uncolored light, dispersing outward into the distinctive shades and hues which comprise the world of perception. While the dogmatic person fixates upon a specific color, truth is red and not green, the contemplative understands all colors as mere expressions of the same light. Writes Schoen, all symbols, all religions, all dogmas, by their negation of error and their affirmation of truth, make it possible to follow the ray of revelation, which is none other than the ray of the intellect, back to its divine source. Finally, it may be worthwhile to note that some perennialists, though certainly not all, conscript the sciences as a support for their perspective. Since physics holds that matter is really energy, the phenomenal universe is therefore the manifestation of a more fundamental reality. Exactly what the contemplative traditions have instructed us for millennia, says some perennialists. I'm an opponent of the perennial philosophy. The point of the rest of this first round is to outline why I am not a perennialist, and nor should you be. But I need to make one thing immediately clear. I have no interest in arguing against the sort of unitary or non-dual insights so prized by many spiritually inclined people. A sense of oneness with nature, a more transcendental idea of the divine, instead of, okay. I still resonate with these kinds of intuitions and beliefs, even if I sympathize with other spiritual directions as well. My issue is, first, with the taking of this one type of experience or sentiment and blowing it up to be the universal, claiming that all higher forms of the spirit must lead to this fundamental insight, and with other religious sensibilities and insights as derivative to it. This is my fundamental target, my first one. My second target is with the metaphysics of oneness that the unitary intuition sometimes leads to. That which deems this concrete, messy, and pluralistic world, along with its problems, as somewhat derivative or of secondary importance. I now present 4 charges against perennialism in a very summary form. Nobody wants to sit through a lecture or something resembling an academic paper. And I think the best points come out in dialogue anyway, in living conversation. So I think the best plan is to go through these rather briefly in a summary fashion, after which Zevi will respond, and I will then respond to him. At one point, the floor will be open for our participants to direct questions to either of us. Many of the most interesting details, certainly of my own position, possibly Zevi's, will come out in this process. All right, listen. These represent my perspective at the moment, or with the last few years or so. I'm not a wise man, so I'm willing, eager to have my position changed about this. The kinds of deep questions we're exploring here, how do all the religions relate to each other? Can we find a common ground? I don't pretend to have an answer for this question, by the way. My whole career is posing questions in front of a classroom that I don't have the answer to. I would just say it's better to be groping constantly towards better and better answers, let's say, really struggling with a problem, than settling upon a facile answer to it, a false answer. So one charge against perennialism is that it's a false answer to the question of religious pluralism. It homogenizes, does violence to the traditions it champions, and it fails to do justice to the true diversity of spiritual insights, both between the religions and within them. In short, perennialism is a fake pluralism. It squeezes other religions into its own model, thus reinterpreting much and ignoring much else. One topic I love talking about when I'm teaching or having a conversation comes from Buddhism. It's the doctrine of anatta, which is Pali, or anatman, which is Sanskrit. The term means no atman. You see, the Hindus believe in the eternal soul, the deep transcendental self. There are different philosophies under Hinduism, of course. And Buddhism entails a rejection of that. And whenever I introduce that to my class, some of the more sophisticated and spiritually oriented students, and I love these the most, they try to qualify it. It goes against what they were hoping Buddhism would be all about, and they say, well, maybe when the Buddhist says anatta or no permanent self, they really mean No, just like the Buddhist calls it anatta, the other religions call it. And of course, I always correct them. It's too easy. Okay. And I would suggest, and one commonly witnesses many who do the same with the Mahayana Buddhist concept of the sunyata, or the void. Sunyata, or void, this is the idea that nothing has well, the most general way to understand it is the doctrine that everything is interdependent. Nothing has a strictly independent existence, okay? So things are empty of any kind of individualized identity. And it's not uncommon that when you talk to those that try to claim that all religions point to the same absolute, well, this is the Mahayana Buddhist idea of the absolute. So it's Brahman for Advaita Vedanta. It's the Godhead for the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. And for the Buddhists, they call it the sunyata, the void, right? It's another absolute. Not so fast. I don't think a person can get away with this so easily, okay? Nagarjuna in the middle way. Nagarjuna is a central and key player in Mahayana Buddhism and the doctrine of the sunyata. He states, emptiness itself is empty. And according to many of the most, I would argue, the most sophisticated scholars of Mahayana Buddhism and the idea of the sunyata, the void, Nagarjuna is trying to get us to not reify this concept into an absolute. It's not another absolute, all right? It's kind of a liberation from all of our metaphysical categories. One of the conditions, of course, toward liberation, okay? So, one key article that I find really instructive is from a Buddhist scholar named Richard K. Payne. It's called Traditionalist Representations of Buddhism. And of course, Zevi will probably explain how his version of perennialism is very, very different than the traditionalists. But I think this is a problem with many perennialists in general, their take on Buddhism, and many religions, by the way. So Richard K. Payne argues that when traditionalists deal with Buddhism, the notion of anatta, or no self, the notion of the sunyata, the void, they engage in these kinds of strategies. One is called overcoding, where you kind of read one concept beneath another concept or on top of it. So yeah, when the Buddhists say anatta, no self, they really mean bigger self, transcendental self. It's like, no, they don't mean that. They quite literally mean no permanent self over and above the flux of physical and mental states, okay? It's an example of overcoding. Selective representation. Certain parts of Buddhism are emphasized and others are ignored for the purposes of the traditionalist's own larger narrative. And they do this with many, many world religions. This reminds me of a discussion I had, and this is a topic that I know Zevi knows very, very well. In the Kabbalistic Judaism, in Lurianic Kabbalah, there is a doctrine proposed by Isaac Luria, okay, the Ari, called the tzimtzum, or the contraction. If you think of God as infinite light, where did God find room to create the cosmos? He has to withdraw a part of himself from the cosmos, make an empty space in order to spill in his light and create the cosmos. Of course, I'm abbreviating this to the millionth degree. And I remember having a discussion, and of course, another concept, the idea of the shavur, the breaking of the vessels, as he began to pour his light into the vessel to create the universe. The light was too strong. We see this as mythological language, of course, and the vessels shattered and bits of light were lost in the void, and the goal of human existence through mitzvot, through good deeds, to restore these embers of light to their source. And I remember having a conversation with someone with strong neo-Hasidic leanings. And this person said, well, you're taking the concept too literally, right? God did not withdraw his essence from any part of the cosmos. He only hid himself. Or in some Hasidic philosophies, it's the own egos coming into being which shuts out the infinite light. This idea of our own false sense of independence, our attachment to self. And we have to overcome that to see God as permeating the whole cosmos. And of course, these are rich parts of our tradition. Every single religion in the world, like Judaism, has rich pluralities, diversities. Of course, a perennialist with a philosophy of oneness would undoubtedly champion the latter interpretation, and will kind of ignore the earlier idea, or kind of ignore it, or make it of secondary importance. Okay, I remember reading, I believe it was a Jewish author deeply influenced by the traditionalists, who constantly spoke about oneness, and he would bring certain aspects of the Lurianic Kabbalistic tradition into his discussion, but ignore other parts. A very kind of selective representation. And maybe a little bit later in our discussion, I'll talk about why I think the earlier and more literal interpretation of Luria, the idea of a divine as actually withdrawing from the cosmos and a primal wound, if you will, at the heart of the absolute, is, I think, a richer notion. Okay, so 2, perennialism is based upon an epistemological arrogance and has built-in safeguards against reflection and criticism. I remember when offering a similar kind of talk some years ago, one gentleman stood up to give a lengthy response, no matter how much I told him, please keep it short. And he began with these words, you don't know everything. To which I responded, look at the claims that were introduced, by the other person, just for one moment. Perennialism claims to know that everything in the cosmos is undergirded by an all-inclusive ultimate reality. And we know a few things about that ultimate reality. Our essential nature, deep, deep down, is already part of this ultimate reality. The very meaning of our existence, our life's purpose, is to realize this connection. And all of the world's religions, doesn't matter what they say on the surface of their scriptures, doesn't matter what they claim for themselves, really deep beneath that, they're pointing to this truth. Okay, we'll ignore the aspects that don't. And for some perennialist, science is beginning to vindicate these ancient truths and will continue to do so. So these comprise probably what can be said to be the single most totalizing set of claims the world has ever seen. And I have seen many speculative and all-inclusive philosophies. So between anyone who holds these claims and another who says, maybe we should take a second look at some of them, all right, I think that it's something to keep in mind. And by what right are these claims made? Being generous, one can find something in the different traditions, which either has a non-dual theme, going beyond subject or object, or can be stretched to accommodate a non-dual and monistic sounding type of philosophy, a philosophy of oneness. But right next to them, one can find teachings that do not. For every Meister Eckhart, there's a Kierkegaard. For every Shankara, there's a Madhva. Okay, Madhva was a pluralist Vedantin. And this goes back right back to the selective representation theme I mentioned just a few minutes ago. One expression I have heard repeatedly from an enthusiast for the perennial philosophy is and traditionalism in particular, is that of saints and sages. Upon what are the doctrines of perennialism based upon? Why these particular doctrines, as opposed to the other kind of schools of thought and what have you? These are based upon saints and sages from the past. Seen in this slide, I can't help but join others in seeing a form of circular reasoning here. What justifies perennialism? The teachings of perennialism are based upon saints and sages. But what precisely makes these individuals saints and sages, as opposed to other figures who say different things? Why? Because they present themes cherished by perennialists. This is a kind of an argument I've seen, assumed, okay, unless I'm wrong. And so in any case, perennialism, another charge against perennialism. Perennialism dismally fails the problem of evil, and it thereby fails to encourage the morally strenuous mood. That's a term I borrowed from William James, who has a kind of an impact on a lot of what I have to say. I was originally going to split this into 2, but they are so intimately related that I kind of combine them. And I need to affirm a few things. Perennialist authors, of course, they express an ethics. One cannot deny this. And the sources that perennialists draw upon, religious traditions, East and West, even if perennialists somehow violate them by kind of pigeonholing them into their wheels, so to speak, they possess a very rich ethics. There's no question about that. And yet at the same time, there's a tendency among perennialists, those that stress that everything is the expression of an all-perfect absolute, to relativize this particular concrete world in which we have our lives, in which we live. To claim that this empirical realm, the everyday world, is the expression of a more perfect reality, it can be argued, A, trivializes the problems of this world, and B, it places the moral quest, the directing of individual and collective energies toward bettering this world, as second to the contemplative one. In the Transcendent Unity of Religions, Fifth Schoen writes, Morality as such obviously has no meaning outside the relatively very restricted domain of action and merit, and therefore in no way extends to such realities as symbolism, contemplation, intellection, and identity through knowledge. By the way, intellection, the intellect for traditionalist authors is not your ability to do math. It's like the highest part of your psyche that is illuminated by the divine and participates in the divine. So ethics in this quote has a place, but the contemplative pushes deeper into the nature of reality, pushing the contemplative over the ethicist in the great scheme of things. And against something like this, there was probably one of the most interesting books there is on perennialism is actually a debate between the process theologian David Ray Griffin and of course the perennialist Huston Smith. And among the many, many topics in this debate, one of the most important is the question of evil. And Smith, of course, Huston Smith says, listen, on this plane of existence, this relative plane, this is not the absolute plane. This relative plane of existence, evil it's there. We have to muster everything we can to fight it. But of course, David Ray Griffin pushes Smith, a little bit for Smith to basically come out and say, well, in the end, evil, like everything else on this plane of existence, only has relative truth. It's not absolutely real. And Smith goes as far as simply at one point to say, yeah, it ultimately does not exist. And it's not I think that's we can go into more detail. This is certainly going to be a topic we're going to argue about during today. And, against a position like this, and many of the, along with many of the classical arguments in theodicy or the attempts to justify God or the absolute in the nature of evil, I think of an essay by Emanuel Levinas, 20th century Jewish philosopher, an essay called Useless Suffering. Levinas here calls for an end to the project of theodicy, for to grant evil a proper role in some philosophical and conceptual scheme is to rationalize and validate it, what he announces as, quote, the source of all immorality, unquote. So one of Levinas's books is, his interpretation of different books from the different parts of the Talmud, different Talmudic readings. And Levinas contrasts what he calls the sacred from the holy. And the sacred is that mystical sense of the numinous that permeates nature, whereas the holy for Levinas is something that's purely transcendent, intimations of which we only get to the eyes of another human being. So this is kind of what you call an anti-totalizing type philosophy, one that emphasizes ethics and our direct relation to other human beings as almost piercing through any kind of absolute picture a metaphysician or philosopher can draw. Of course, that was very abstract, I know, but as we talk, maybe he'll enter into our stream of conversation again. Okay, so finally, the fourth charge, there are more inclusive and richer models than perennialism, okay? And what do I mean by that? More inclusive and richer in regards to what, Richer and inclusive means, one, that it does more justice to the diversity of spiritual orientations and insights, both between and within the religions. Two, that it encourages critical reflection and even revision upon its most basic concepts. Three, that it recognizes rather than trivializes evil. And four, that it gives the ethical life a more compelling and forceful direction. It does not place the ethicist beneath the contemplative. Now, I don't have the time in this first volley to unpack all the details, but in regards to some figures I'll mention. But I think too, here's one, I cannot get away, each one of us has some figure that is very influential for us. And I remember when someone was asking us for our bios for this debate, and they said, John, what would you label yourself as? I guess I kind of veer toward a Jamesian radical empiricist and a Jamesian pluralist. Jamesian pluralism, William James, great American philosopher, psychologist, who also offered something of a philosophical theology in his works. He, in his book Pragmatism, James distinguishes between different models of the cosmos, okay, in regards to salvation, in regards to philosophy of religion. One of them is the pessimistic one, in which there is no hope for redemption, kind of a brute materialism. Then there is an optimistic one, in which the cosmos is already undergirded by a transcendental perfection, which is something I see similar to the kinds of metaphysics that perennialists love. Finally, there is a melioristic one, a cosmos that is imperfect and yet amenable to human efforts for its improvement. And it's, in light of this, James argues his version of a deity, a God, the Jamesian God that he offers at the end of the varieties of religious experience and a pluralistic universe and elsewhere, is kind of like a mother seed consciousness, which underlies our own. All right, so it does some justice to the transcendental, and yet a God that is finite, that itself has an outside environment or is limited in power or knowledge or what have you. So in this sense, I guess my Jewish ears get, the idea of the human beings as a kind of co-creator with the divine, a partner. James is not Jewish, but of course, I guess coming from these two streams, classical American thought and coming from my Jewish background, this kind of, this idea really resonates with me. All right, so this is one in which, very much open to experience, and one in which the contemplative is not placed over the ethicist, spiritual experience, not over our need to push up against things. James, of course, was extremely influential on the Anglo-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Process and Reality and Religion in the Making. I mean, Whitehead went through different stages of his thought. He was a mathematician, then a philosopher of science, and then a great metaphysician who created this philosophy of organism. Out of Whitehead and thinkers like Charles Hartshorne, you'd have what's, process theology. And contemporary process theologians offer something they call deep religious pluralism. So for the process philosopher, for the perennialist, if all of the religions, the high spiritual traditions, in their esoteric tradition, their mystical tradition, lead to the same ultimate reality, the deep religious pluralism espoused by process theologians speaks of three ultimates. Okay, a personal ultimate that speaks to kind of like a God with a personality who loves, who cares. And by the way, I'm abbreviating this tremendously. I'm not going to sit here and give all the details of what process metaphysics entails, the notion of an actual occasion. And, this is really ornate and complex stuff. So I'm just talking about, what's important for this talk here. A personal ultimate that can speak to, this an I-thou relationship to a divine with a personality, an impersonal ultimate, that's sort of those who prefer a more transpersonal or the idea of a transcendental ground or a cosmic ground can speak to, can resonate with, connect with, I should say. And of course, the world of actual occasions, that is to say, a universe composed that's not unreal, that's not made relatively real, that's still part of the nature of things. And, for those who prefer a kind of animism or prefer a kind of a nature religion, that would speak to that. And, it would take a very long time to go into more detail about how I kind of think, deep religious pluralism in the most general sense, the idea that reality is sufficiently complex and textured, all right, that different world religions, they connect with different aspects of reality. I think that's a better direction, should we say, than one in which the claims that all the religions have to point to one ultimate reality. Because ultimately, if you do that, one is placed as more real, the other as more derivative, one model of things. And I think that is not as inclusive and rich a picture. So I know some of you are thinking, okay, when's this guy going to stop? This has been going on a little while. Omar, how am I doing here with time?
I already sent you a 5-minute message about 10 minutes ago.
How many minutes ago?
Go ahead and finish it off.
Okay, I'm almost done. Okay, just one last thing and I'm done. But I apologize to everybody. No one left, did they? I would have. Sorry. A final personal note, as someone who much of my life is infatuated with the world religions, there was a period of time in my life when I was a perennialist, by the way. And to me, the different religions of the world were like spokes leading to one center, the old cliche idea, or different sides of a mountain leading to the top, But the minute I dropped my model by which to pigeonhole different religions into it, I just dropped it. And I approach each religion in its uniqueness and in its particularity. And I ask myself, what can this teach me? Not simply as another spoke to the center, let's say, or another route up to the same place as other traditions. What is unique this religion can teach me? That the second I dropped the perennial philosophy, the study and approach to world religions became a much more interesting endeavor, okay? And it would be for you too, if you don't have this model. So I apologize about ignoring sort of, the prompts sent by Omar, and I'm done for now. That was my first volley there. Okay.
Thank you, John. And now, Zevi, please begin, and we'll get to questions later.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Omar. I cannot imagine a better conversational partner to be engaging with in this question, and I cannot imagine a more important conversation to be having at a time like this. And I'm really glad, John, that you introduced perennialism. I find from reading your works that when you introduce perennialism in general, far from strawmanning the position, you in fact steelman it, and even you present an inspired version of perennialism, and I think it harkens back to the days when it was an inspiring philosophy for you. We frame this as a debate, but I think it's really going to be more, hopefully, of a deep, careful spiritual conversation, an opportunity to encounter and learn from one another and from the audience. We just called it a debate because debate is a sexier title for such a thing, but really it's going to be, hopefully, a deep conversation of learning. And leading up to this debate, reading John's articles, I mentioned to John, has been really a deeply spiritual and enriching experience for me, and I've learned a lot, and I'd like to express my gratitude. I already have in private to John, but in public to thank John for the work that he's done on this, for the thinking that he's done, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I think that the role of good thinking, and along with that with good living, is about keeping our positions open to change, open to reflection, and once we have all of the evidence taken for granted and we assume what the conclusion is, there really isn't a possibility to change our mind, and our life and our thinking and our minds can become quite stale as a result. And I continue to try to remain open, and I know John lives that same spirit. So I would like to first repeat back, just to summarize John's primary critiques as I've understood them, and then present perhaps a version of perennialism, an idiosyncratic, perhaps a personal version of perennialism, which may work around some of the critiques that John posed and may present an alternative vision, alternative story. And Omar, please do interrupt me when I've reached a critical point in time. So John presented 4 critiques. One is that perennialism homogenizes religious pluralism. It does violence to the true multiplicity and diversity that we find in religions. Number 2, that there's a deep epistemological arrogance. Perennialism claims to know the absolute and the transcendent, and with its knowledge of the absolute, indulges in circular reasoning which proves it and which seems to be unfalsifiable. Number 3, which was an amalgamation of 2 points, was the fact that perennialism ignores evil as a true reality, and as a result lacks the moral strenuousness to combat evil. And number 4 is that there are more inclusive and richer models available to us other than perennialism, and John indicated towards some of those, whether that be a form of Whiteheadian process thought, or whether it be a Jamesian deep pluralism, and those, I know that John is still himself working those positions out and hasn't come to a final position, and I admire that in his thinking. I think there's 2 ways perhaps to go about this presentation. One is to go to nitpick on points that there may be some disagreement about, and I think between us that may be a very enriching conversation to have. John's presentation of some of the topics that are closer to my heart and mind, whether that be Lurianic Kabbalah or Hasidic philosophy, and differ in some of his presentations of those. But I think that a more fruitful use of our time and all of our time here will be to present in larger picture another version of perennialism that may speak differently to the reality that we have here. And what I'd like to defend here is not perennialism as a tradition, and certainly not traditionalism. Anyone who knows me and I work knows that I have no love for the traditionalists, and I'm quite vocal in my opposition and distancing myself for them, and I don't share their antipathy for modernity, and I don't share the way in which they shade very comfortably into fascism and other terrible things. I like to defend a version of perennialism, which is not the tradition of perennialism, but the idea of perennialism. The tradition of perennialism has all kinds of characters, colorful characters, modern characters, whether that be someone like an early James himself or someone like Huxley with his Perennial Philosophy. And I don't find myself compelled to defend these individuals as part of any gospel or canon. But the idea of the perennialist speaks deeply to me, and I'd like to explain why it does and why it perhaps may speak deeply to you as well. And I would love to hear John's thoughts on this as well. Whenever we make any act of perception or conception, whenever we see or think of anything, there's always two things going on. We experience diversity and we experience commonality. We experience patterns and we experience noise. This is simply the function of human perception. It's impossible. If we only saw patterns and commonality, then we would be schizophrenic and we would be locked away quite quickly. If we only saw noise, then we would never be able to make it out of our homes in the morning. I, for example, when I pick up a cup, I know that this is a cup because it seems to me to have commonalities with other cups out there, and yet I do understand that it's different in that it's porcelain and that it has a specific liquid inside which isn't shared with all cups out there. This is a very simplistic presentation, but the notion here is applied, I think, on a grander scale to religions as a whole. When we look at religions, we see a tremendous amount of difference and diversity, as John rightfully pointed out, and far be it for me to deny the diversity of religion. I would actually like to champion religious diversity. But we also see commonality. And anyone who's studying religion long enough begins to see these common themes. The perennial urge is simply noting the commonality that exists amongst religions and asking, what is this commonality and where is it coming from? When we look at the commonality of the religious traditions, we begin to notice, as John was saying, that there's, on the exoteric side of the traditions in their theologies, there is great diversity. As John mentioned, that for the Christian, Jesus is a third person of the triune Godhead who's incarnate through virgin birth, and those that believe in him have salvation eternally. For the Muslim, this is an anathema. For the Jew, nothing could be further than the truth. For the Buddhist, there's an entirely different reality that doesn't include the gods of the West at all, and so on and so forth. But John indicated as well that the perennialists point to a common side of the religions, a common side of the traditions, the esoteric side, the inside of the tradition. And I just want to highlight for a second that this is not an invention of the perennialists nor of the traditionalists who place an even greater emphasis upon this, but this is something that we find within the religious traditions themselves. Religious traditions distinguish between their exoteric and their esoteric side, whether that be amongst Jewish thinkers who distinguish between the Nigla and the Nistar, or whether this be in Islam, which differentiates between Batin and Zahir. This is a distinction made by traditions themselves. The Dharma in Buddhism, as opposed to more popular forms of the religion, this is a distinction made. What I'd like to push here, and this might be a bit evocative and challenging, is that these traditions themselves actually go a step further. In addition to just distinguishing between the general esoteric and exoteric, they go one step further to introduce an esoteric of the esoteric. And at this point, this may sound like hair splitting and some fun games, but in Jewish mysticism, for example, we speak about Sod Shebesod. Amongst the Druze, they speak about the Batin el-Batin, and this is quite a common position deriving from Ismailism and earlier on from Neoplatonism. The advantage of splitting a tradition further down and further down is that if we believe that there is some sort of human truth at the core of a religion, we also know that humans are very good at encrusting truths with all kinds of superstitions and dogmas and accretions that collect over the centuries. And there's a need constantly within religion perceived as a human construct, to strip away from those externalities and come to something on the inside which is true, or truer perhaps. And even within the inner, that same process undergoes again, where the inner tradition can become again encrusted and needs to be stripped away. And what I'd like to present here is a thought experiment as a way of framing or reframing perennialism, call it a neo-perennialism perhaps, is instead of looking at the perennialists and the mystics who are proposed by the perennialists and the small handful of them, which many who John already mentioned, whether it be Nagarjuna or Meister Eckhart or St. John of the Cross or Luria or whoever it is, instead, let us think of these men and women as philosophers, as great philosophers through the ages, not as saints and sages whose words are canon and sacred, who we must adhere to at all costs, but as philosophers who are proposing a theory for life, and a theory which is corroborated by what they posit as their empirical experience, which I don't believe that we have access to anyone else's empirical experience, but there's a chance that we may perhaps also be privy to such experiences, and that may validate these theories for us as well. And when we look at them as philosophers, as theoreticians presenting an idea about living life, we can begin to look at things a bit differently, and we're no longer indebted to them and to all of their philosophy. Very much like we can take the syllogism from Aristotle without taking his explicit sexism. And we're entitled to this. We can take Heidegger's contemplation on being and time, and we don't have to take his infatuation with National Socialism, with Nazism. We're entitled to do this with philosophers. And I think that what would serve best for us is to not try and do a top-down version of perennialism. A top-down version which proposes some sort of metaphysical truth, but instead one which proposes a human narrative, a human story, about humans having specific experiences which are leading them to specific theories. And that begins all the way in the ancient Greeks, with people like Parmenides and Heraclitus, down to Plato and Plotinus, and all the way in the Far East, humans having unique experiences that challenge their everyday view of reality and proposing theories to make sense of those realities or those experiences. And I think that from this position, we in fact do not have to make any broad, large metaphysical claims about any absolute or any ultimates. We can remain skeptical and agnostic towards those positions, and I think that the best of the mystics throughout the ages have championed such a position, whether it be mystics in the West who speak about a negative theology, a God who we can never ultimately know, and therefore we cannot speak about the absolute in any ultimate terms, or whether that be in the East where we negate anything that's said about the metaphysics in the form of neti neti, that neither this nor that. And I think that this humility of the mystics, which we can follow through in our own humility, allows us to respond to the second of John's critiques, which is that we don't need to know everything. And I'll propose what it is that I think we do need to know and take from these mystics in this version of perennialism. We don't have to homogenize all religions, because we can appreciate both the diversity and the commonality and understand that those things are not oppositional. We can understand that each religion has its own unique genius to contribute to us and remain open to those contributions. I want to speak to a second about the problem of evil, which I know is very close to Jonathan's heart. But before getting to that, I want to ask, what is it that we can take from the perennialists, or from this perennialist interpretation of mysticism? And what I think we can take, as opposed to proposing some sort of transcendent, totalizing being who we partake in, I think at the very least what we can propose, and I think this is so necessary for today's day and age, is a story, a framework, a narrative of interconnectivity. That as opposed to one version of seeing reality, wherein we are all separate individuals who have no real deep relationship or interconnectivity with one another or with the world around us, and therefore we have to function for our own survival, sort of this social Darwinianism. Instead, we can come to see reality as deeply interconnected, organistic, in the way that Jonathan put it in regards to Whitehead. And I think this, in fact, can be corroborated by the sciences. And I know this is something that the perennialists like to do, and I'm not going to do it, but on a very basic level, looking at the world not from a position of Democratian atomism, where everything is a separate billiard ball bouncing through reality, including ourselves as separate billiard balls bouncing through and bumping into each other, but instead as deeply interconnected parts of one giant organism. And the metaphors for this abound from all traditions, whether it's Idra's web in the East, or whether it is the notion from the Kabbalists of the divine who fractures the divine self into many sparks, and we are all sparks of that divine. And this is a notion which is really found across traditions. And I think starting from a very humble place epistemologically, we can take hold of a story, because what we lack today is we lack a story. We lack a direction that gives us any sense of purpose and any sense of morality going forward. And this brings me to the question of morality. I think that John's critiques of the morality of perennialism are very astute. And I want to propose something here, and I'd be very curious to hear what John, who's thought about these issues far longer than I have. I do believe that when we read the mystics carefully, we see them often denying an ultimate reality of evil, but we see them also denying an ultimate reality of goodness. And what they instead propose is simply the suchness of reality. That things are is all there is. And the notion of giving a moral judgment of whether something is good or evil is understood to be a human construct which comes later, which is labeled upon reality. Rumi says, "Meet me by the meet me in the tree by the field which is beyond good and evil. And I think it's important to notice that it is beyond evil, but beyond good as well. And I think that this gives us a place for morality, and I'll explain why in a second. But just before getting to that, I think that the positing a real reality of evil may be as much as a problem for the naturalist as it is for the perennialist. I don't know of a good naturalistic explanation for an ontology of evil, as much as it lacks amongst the mystics. But the mystics, I think, also don't have a real ontology of good. Sometimes they conflate being and good, and that becomes a bit tricky. We say that in Plotinus and he's reading of Plato, but I think in many mystics we don't see this conflation happening. We see a God who is, or reality which is beyond being, which is beyond good itself, beyond good and evil. What then is the ethic of mysticism, which Jonathan pointed to? And the ethic of mysticism is certainly there in their action. Jonathan knows better than anyone here that William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, speaks about the mystic as the vanguard of morality, the person who rides the crest, showing humanity the way forward in their humility and in their kindness and in their selflessness. The ethic of the mystic and the moral strenuousness of the mystic is like none other. The ethic of the mystic is, if we do believe that we are all deeply, fundamentally interconnected with one another, to the point where my identity as a separate being, separate entirely from you, that notion falls away, then the same way that I naturally, it's not even an obligation, that I naturally love myself in a healthy situation, I also love the other who I see as integrated or interdependent or interconnected with the self. And I think this is the greatest moral call, and this is a case made at length by Joseph Campbell and others. And I think in contrast to Levinas's position, which John was presenting, where the ethic comes specifically from the otherness of the other, which I have great admiration for Levinas's theology, and Levinas presents that as the Jewish position. I think that in fact the Jewish position of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, which is echoed by Jesus in the New Testament as well, is that we love the other as the self, and the mystics read that not as the self like it's the self, but as the self because it is in some way a expansion or expression of the self. The mystic chooses to expand their identity outwards, or to collapse any sort of self-identity inwards until no identity exists, so that all that's left is self-love for all of reality. And I think that message is so needed today in the face of catastrophic climate crises, in the face of catastrophic wars, where there's senseless killing, which things that we thought were the past continue on today. I think what we do need is the ethic of the mystic, who doesn't act from a place of good or evil, but simply from a place of love and self-care for all of reality. Number 4, are there more inclusive and richer models available to us than perennialism? If we are speaking about an old form of perennialism, the tradition of perennialism, as presented by people perhaps like Huxley and others, then yes, there certainly are. But if we're speaking about a new type of perennialism, a perennialism which is open to the criticisms of a totalizing metaphysic, that are open to the criticisms of someone who didn't yet feature in the conversation, someone like Professor Stephen Katz and his critiques of his contextual or constructivist critiques, I think there's space for a new perennialism, a perennialism which approaches the world religions afresh and does not feel obligated to take them all into account. I think that the notion that a religious pluralism must take all of religion into account would struggle with things like the Branch Davidians and the Charles Manson and all other things, and distinguishing between cults and religions is simply a value judgment, I believe. I don't think we need to take all religions into account. We can appreciate them for their diversity, but I think that there is a very deep direction of commonality and unity and interconnectedness, which is pointed to by many of the great mystics who we can see as philosophers from all traditions, and by embracing that not a strong metaphysical narrative, but a lived narrative, a pragmatic narrative about how we can go forward, reconceptualizing our own being, then I think we have a much healthier world ahead of us. And I'd like to end with one last thought and then turn back to Jonathan and to the audience. I think part of this project that I'm proposing here is to begin afresh by looking at the mystics, by looking at the great men and women who have been the geniuses of the spirit in this regard, the great philosophers, and truly many of them were philosophers and logicians and metaphysicians in a classic sense, and asking what is it that we can find common amongst them while respecting what differentiates them and respecting the genius that they bring independently. And some of the directions that we may bring, I've done some work with a colleague of mine, a professor of philosophy, a professor of logic, looking at the logic of the mystics and what logic the language of mysticism and what linguistic metaphors are they using. These are all kinds of work that can be done from a very fruitful, from a very humble ground up perspective. I'll end with one thought, and this has been a very central notion to me, and this has been pointed out by the great scholar Mircea Eliade, the Romanian scholar of religion, something found by the mystics, which is the notion of initiation, and not initiation in the way that the traditionalists, who I don't like at all, talk about, but initiation in the sense that to come to a sense of interconnectedness, to a sense of seeing our being as interrelated to all of being, we must first let go of an initial sense, a small sense of ego, the small I. And this process of death and rebirth, which Eliade points out as a common theme amongst many of the world's mystics and mythologies, I think is one of the richest ideas that we find amongst the mystics as we move forward and begin to find these rich ideas. The notion that, like the seed is planted into the ground, which must first dissolve before it can blossom into something much greater than itself, we hang on tenaciously to a very small sense of self, our very small egos that are concerned with our own survival at the cost of anything else. And the most liberating thing that we could do, and I think that this is something which resonates east and west, present and past, is to let go of that tiny notion of self, is to see that self-preservation is not the greatest end that which we can live our days to, but if we live our lives in service, in altruism, in kindness, in seeing the other as interconnected to the self, if we can let go of that small self, what my own tradition, the Hasidic tradition, would call a bitul hayash, what Islam would call fana, many traditions have a term for this, what the Christian mystic would call crucifixion, we can be reborn into something greater, into something part of the whole. And this, I think, is part of the vision, just one small gem from what I believe can be fairly said all of the world mystics. And on that, I would like to turn back to John and back to the audience. And I would like to, again, thank everyone for joining us here, and thank John for being such a generous and gracious and erudite partner in this conversation.
Bravo. John, you're on.
Well, I just first of all, I knew that I'd be showed up, I mean, that was absolutely beautiful, and I don't know what to say after some of that, that was really interesting. What I kind of hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I won't take long here because I kind of want to open up for discussion, other people asking questions, I mean, after I went over the time, no one wants to hear a lecture, would it be correct to say what you offer us is kind of a softened perennialism a little bit? Like some of the, if not the absolute itself, the absolutism of the position has been kind of removed, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And one that's open to correction a little bit, one that's a bit more open to the uniqueness and the particularity of the religions it's looking at, it seems.
Yes,
and yet the same.
If we're not open to correction, if we're not open to learn, that we may as well dig our graves. We're here to learn. We're here to expand and change.
Then again, I'm not really trying to assume that people espouse a perennialist philosophy are not open to correct. I mean, that'd be a big a straw man and a homonym and a few other fallacies.
Sure.
But I suppose I can just aim at you. How about this? Let me just two quick things really quickly. It's very, very, very. There's a beautiful series of documentaries called The Long Search that came out in the 1970s. And there's one on Mahayana Buddhism in Japan, also did a little bit of Shintoism in that same episode. And a Roshi, a Zen master, he says, when someone asks him about an ethics or something along those lines in Zen Buddhism, he says, listen, when I am no longer I, when there's a unity, no longer a me versus a you, we become one. I can see no greater love than this. But a part of me wants to ask, why can't that equally be a kind of indifference? In other words, what is propelling me forward to the other? And certainly a lot of individuals that explore mysticism explore how it can invigorate the moral life because it gives a sense of buoyancy to the self. It makes me not centered around my ego or questions about what I can get out of things. But at the same time, Levinas, by the way, which I gave I mentioned a few things about him. I mean, I barely went into anything about him, but he offers a kind of rich phenomenology, talks about structures of experience. And Levinas sees himself as pushing beyond phenomenology because there's something about the other that always exceeds, what I can kind of, even you can't even call the other a phenomenon. It's what he calls an enigma. It's something that's always one step outside of what my mind can close around. But the other comes to me in the mode of height, something over and above, something over me, all right, to whom I am indebted. So there's a kind of, he would oppose this sense of unity between myself and the other as not providing us a hard enough ethics, that somehow the other has to be in the mode of height, something to which I am direct. It's almost like there's a moral sort of task imposed upon me in the moment of experiencing that other. So I'm wondering if a simple, and I'm not calling anything you say simple, but a sort of a mystical intuition of unity can be as strong as another form of ethics, which is truly kind of directs me toward the other, right? I'm also interested, by the way, in one topic. I did this to you when you gave your talk on Spinoza, and I did this with the Perennialists. Just tell us, is there an ultimate underlying everything that's all good? Or you're trying to say it's beyond good, it's beyond our moral categories, right? But clearly it's an absolute of some kind. Otherwise it wouldn't have religious significance for us. So whence evil, right? You treated this quite a bit, but I'm still interested. Finally, is evil truly a part of the nature of things, or is it a product of my avidya or primal ignorance, or maya, or an illusion? Okay.
Yeah. Firstly, I want to say that mysticism certainly can and has historically tended into what's known as quietism. And I'm not explaining what this term means for John. John knows, but for the audience, perhaps, quietism is a sense of accepting the fate of all reality, that things are as they must be, and therefore there's nothing that can be done or nothing that should be done to change it. A mystical version of some sort of fatalism or determinism. And I'm not saying that mysticism in all of its expressions always throughout history has always been roses and strawberries. Certainly not the case. And I think that anything at all, when it is taken out of proportion, when it is misused, when it is misapplied, goes horribly wrong sometimes. And it needs to be brought back in. It needs to be reined in from its extremities. And mysticism certainly is the case. And quietism is a great moral example when indifference does emerge from the position of the mystic, and that we must stay vigilant towards that. And I think though that it, by and large, it is a minority of historical phenomena amongst the mystics. So the critique that mysticism, or even the version that I'm presenting, may lead to quietism, is certainly a valid criticism, and we must remain vigilant of that eventuality and not deny that eventuality. But I think that there is within mysticism itself that which can safeguard us from quietism. And I think the same way, for example, that Levinas's position of seeing the other as the face which called the revelation from and beyond us, as the height of the ethical call, the thou shalt not kill in the face of the other, can also lead to indifference. If I see the other as entirely other, and I can other them to a degree where I don't care at all about them, and therefore their faces of no revelation to me. And how many times do we walk down the street and see an other and consider them entirely othered, or do we other an entire population and we have no problem exterminating or vilifying or these? So othering, while there's potential ethical insight, as Levinas so beautifully points out, there's also potential for indifference there as well. And I don't think any philosophy is safe from this. Where I think within mysticism there may be a response to the quietistic, to the indifference, is in the sense that there is a true, healthy care for the self. We are, generally speaking, in a healthy, functioning human, not indifferent to our own suffering and our own pain. And the highest ethic of the mystic, as expressed by many, both historically and contemporary scholars of mysticism, is feeling our own sense of real concern for our own real pain and our own desire for our own flourishing, feeling that in the other as much as we feel it in the self. And that is, I cannot think of a higher propulsion in the moral life, and I think that this bears fruit, and William James' account bears this out perhaps more beautifully than anyone else. The deep moral fruit bore by the mystics, who take whether it's someone like Saint Francis of Assisi, who is just a beautiful human, whether it's someone like Etty Hillesum, who goes through the death camps of the Nazis and holds on to this deep sense of hope and compassion for humanity. And these are inspired mystics, seeing the world as not other from them, but seeing them as integrally some part of themselves. So I think both in theory and in practice, the high claim is there. The example brought by, I remember this kind of seared into my memory and consciousness, the example brought by Joseph Campbell when he speaks about the ethic of the mystic, and the book I think is Thou Art That is the book where he writes this. He writes of a story of a Hawaiian policeman who is by a cliff, and there's a child who's leaning over and almost falling off the cliff, and the policeman endangers their own life to grab the child off the precipice. And later when he was interviewed by and the child and the policeman shared no commonality, no blood, they weren't of the same nationality, the same culture, the same race. They were entirely different. And they asked the policeman, "Why did you endanger your own life against protocol? You shouldn't have done that. To step onto the ledge yourself. You don't know whether it could have taken your weight." And the policeman says that it was saving myself. There wasn't a question of saving something other than me. And it may not have, he may not have even read the mystics, but the intuition that the other is not fundamentally other from us, the unothering of the other. Nicholas of Cusa refers to God as none other than the non-other, that thing which can be never othered. And when we see the divine in the other, we see that which can never be othered from us. And I think there's an incredible moral power and impetus in that, and one that inspires me and many people historically in their own lives.
Absolutely beautiful, beautiful answer. So I'm thinking, maybe Omar, you think maybe we'll take a question and answer, or we'll invite is it time for that?
Sure, we can start. Is there anyone right now who'd like to start with a question?
Yeah.
Let me raise some issues. And so each of these philosophies, in fact, or each of these religions, they take themselves to be the ultimate final truth. But at the same time, they are incommensurable. They're talking past each other. If you tell them, I'm speaking to what's common, they'll say, no, thank you. You are not. Don't speak for me. You're missing the point.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points here. One point, Omar, is that I'm not claiming to present a picture which every single person who ascribes to every single religion in the world is going to be down for. And that's not the objective of this. That would be way too audacious to make. What I'm saying is that there's a specific version which I find to be common to the world's religions from their esoteric readings, and my intuition, and I want to be open to the evidence. I want to be open to the world's traditions. I want to look at these traditions and look to their inner sides. And very often, when I sit down with a religious person and I present a perennialistic perspective, they'll tell me, "Oh, that's not what I, as a Christian, let's say, believe." And then I say, "Well, let us turn to some great Christian saints and figures who you yourself revere, and let us learn them together, and let us see what they say." And I have this many times with Protestants, for example, who Protestants are woefully ignorant of their own mystical traditions. They believe that only Catholics have mysticism. And when you open them up to the great Protestant mystics, whether it be a William Blake, whether it be a Rufus Jones, just many of them, George Fox, and the richness of people's own traditions, I think, sometimes shocks them. And many Jews who are very, very ignorant of the inner side of Judaism, the mystical side, what would accord with my version, my presentation. And I think it's a slow process of both being humble to come and hear the other and to learn from the other without feeling obligated to take on and take in every single perspective that presents as religious, and also to educate ourselves in the traditions of the other so that we can begin to discover this commonality and help people discover it for themselves in their own traditions, in their own language, in their own context. And if someone at the end of the day feels that it's entirely an anathema and antithetical to what they believe, then they're entitled to their belief, and I'm entitled to mine, and we live in a beautiful world, and that allows that. I think Miss Sirota here had a question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm fascinated by kind of the sleight of hand that you, Zevi, did, and you changed the form of the discussion from a debate to a discussion and a dialogue. And I'm really struck by that. And I'm kind of really almost stunned, because we were prepared for a debate and who's right and wrong. So I'm just fascinated how you it's almost like a sleight of hand. You did, you switched it around, and you turned into something else.
First of all, Necha, thank you. That's a really profound insight. And Zevi and I spoke about this with each other too, that, we would be more of, I don't think I'm going to beat Zevi in a debate anyway, even if it was a debate.
Okay, well,
But we would both walk away enriched. That's the idea. I certainly am walking away enriched. I'm not walking away.
Likewise.
Zevi, you want to address it or?
Yeah, I think there was something. I appreciate that observation. I think there was something funny that happened when this debate was proposed. Both Jonathan and I independently wrote that I don't feel like I could debate with Jonathan, and Jonathan said I don't feel like I could debate with Zevi. We both asked independently whether this could be done in the spirit of a dialogue, of a discussion, and I was very humbled by Jonathan's gesture in that direction, and I certainly did not want to come and debate with Jonathan, a man of many years of learning and erudition, which I'm just beginning to tread in the waters of. If anyone feels like they didn't get their money's worth and they came for a good old debate and brawl, they should turn to Isaac Schonfeld and they should get their refund. But otherwise, I very much enjoyed this possibility to come and to share and to learn in a spirit of friendship and a spirit of mutual enrichment. The debate itself comes from Old French and Latin originally, which is this the sense of this battle, this war that's being done to batter the other, and I definitely don't have any interest in battering anyone else. My project is seekers of unity. I look for unity. I look for commonality, and the spirit of debate is not one which I'm seeking to court. So I apologize for the misleading marketing.
Can I follow up with a question? In the Ethics of the Fathers, actually in the Mishnah of the Machlokas L'Shem Shamayim, there are differences of opinion which have a good purpose, for lack of I can't think of another word. So would you put, where would you put that category when you are having an argument to say for a higher purpose? Let's go with that.
Yes, I think the notion, what seems to be uniquely and very very characteristically Jewish notion of a machlokes l'shem shemaim, of the debate for the sake of heaven, is a tremendous notion and a tremendous talking about the genius of each individual tradition and what it brings to the table. I think that's a high watermark of Jewish genius. And if this is a machlokes l'shem shemaim, then I would be very honored to have partaken in it, and in the end we will be the judges, all of us, whether this was a machlokes l'shem shemaim. And the Mishnah concludes there that if it is, then it is sefer lehiskayamas. It is guaranteed to endure. And I hope that this debate, this conversation, this machlokes l'shem shemaim does endure for many years, because I certainly don't want to close my own world and my own mind to beautiful minds like those of Jonathan and Omar and yourself and everyone who came to join us here today.
I've been asked to return people's funds. So before I give people back their money, I just want to ask you guys, what you, Jonathan especially, you said, well, I'm going to come to this debate discussion prepared to change my mind. What would have done it for you, and what was missing? Why didn't either one of you change your mind, and what would it have been that would have done it?
That's a fantastic question, but you're assuming we didn't change our minds. I certainly, the problems I pointed out with perennialism become a little bit different. If we're going to offer something, richer, softer, more ready to accommodate. So I would say I'm still centering on evil as a fundamental issue. And still, I think the ethics offered by perennialism, even though it's really profound what it's found in the original sources, different mystical traditions and different religions, I still think it needs a kind of invigorating by being informed by let's say a view of the universe as more flawed, should we say? But in any case, I know that takes me. That's become a larger conversation. But after Zevi answers this, then I want to read Stephen Ross's question for us.
Yeah, that's actually a really beautiful question. I appreciate it. Thank you as well. I think that I mean, I had distinct opportunity to spend the past few days reading many of the essays which Jonathan had written over the years addressing these questions. So much of the argumentation that John presented tonight in a very, very abbreviated form, I had the chance to sit with, over Omar and over Shabbat and really steep in the thought and words of John, which was a tremendously enriching and challenging experience for me. You can ask the friends around me that I was in a daze for a few days, just sort of opening up my mind to the possibilities of the thought. Very, very, it was an existential experience in a real way. And this is not the first time that I've encountered John's writing. When I came initially to present on Spinoza, and John was part of that conversation, I had a chance to read some of his writing as well. And I would like to give a recommendation for anyone who is interested in these themes at greater depth to read the works that John has, and perhaps if you would share those, as about 5 or 6 central essays that John has written on the subject, which explore the themes that he brings up from William James and from Levinas and from Dewey and from Whitehead at much greater depth. I think what struck me reading those initially, so as I'm saying, most of the encounter happened off screen. What struck me initially was a final point which John mentioned here as well. For me, it's tonight. For you, I'm not sure what time it is. The notion that what changed in John's own experience after having abandoned a perennialistic worldview, and that was that the world traditions finally became interesting to him in a way which they never were before. Whereas before they were just trying to be fit into one giant, elaborate model, they now became things with their own meaning and their own locus of identity and their own, and that to me really, really struck me and really made me question myself of how do I approach a religion? Do I approach religion with my a priori assumptions, knowing what I expect to find, and look for what fits it and discard what doesn't? And that is the worst of any way of doing any learning, is a terrible selection bias, where no real learning happens, or we're looking is to validate our own positions, and which has no possibility, as John mentioned, of being falsifiable. Or am I approaching these religions really to learn about their spiritual experience in a way that is not known to me already, in a way that can be novel and can change my world? One of my own spiritual mentors, who I never had the chance of meeting in my own life, was a man by the name of Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi. And Reb Zalman has a beautiful phrase which he calls spiritual voyeurism, that when we approach another religious tradition, we can be inspired by their spirituality, by their form of intimacy, by their form of worship and prayer and service and devotion and meditation and contemplation. And I seek to hold on to that spirit of spiritual voyeurism when I see a new tradition, when I go to meet, when I go to greet, and through the work that I'm doing at the channel and Seekers of Unity, we go around Israel to meet religious minorities, which we wouldn't otherwise have the chance to, whether that's the Druze or the Baha'i or the Ahmadiyya, the Kirkazim, and so on and so forth. And I go not to try and see, hopefully, with the spirit of John, I go not to see how they fit into my own system, but what I can learn from them and how they can change my world and how they can change my relationship to God in profound ways. And I think that's what I've taken away from John's writing. One amongst many things. I could give a whole hour presentation of things which I've learned from John, but I'll spare the audience that.
That's such a stunningly beautiful answer. I don't even know what to say. Would it be okay if I read Stephen Ross's question to us?
Of course.
He wants to add one more thing. It is from the Prajna Paramita. In emptiness, form is formless and formlessness is form. The question I ask the teachers leading our conversation is, do you seek ideas or freedom from life and death? Mind you, I love ideas as much as you do. Of course, I am not asserting one religion over another. And I just want to say, I remember Omar and I, when we were in grad school together, we had a professor who would always answer everything with a pithy kind of sharp-edged remark. I'm not going to mention his name. Okay. Finally, one of his acolytes, one of his grad students, said to him, are you never not joking? And this professor said, I am never just joking. So I definitely, Stephen, I work with ideas. But even when I work with ideas, when I think about concepts, when I read books, when I comprise arguments, ideas are never, for me, just ideas. They're very intimately intertwined with ways of looking at the world, orientations to life. Okay, I feel them all the way down. Zevi.
Yes, I have to agree with John. I think it's important to remain vigilant to not be lost in ideas. As a beautiful Sufi parable of the Sufi seeker, the mystic who's ascending the mountain up to Allah, up to God, and on the way he passes by a fellow who's been traversing the path for way longer but hasn't gotten quite as far, if we can put this on some sort of linear trajectory here, which certainly is not. And he as he passes by this fellow, he sees that he has a donkey with him, and the donkey has these saddlebags, and the saddlebags are filled with books of philosophy and mysticism and poetry and literature, and they're really weighing him down. And there certainly is a possibility for our own spiritual developments, for our own developments to be better, kinder people, to be weighed down by books and by ideas. However, on the other hand, as John says, we all approach the world with our own art form, and art is really to take some sort of feeling which cannot be expressed easily and to try and find the words to convey it. And for the musician, their medium of expressing that is the violin or the piano and the notes which they play. For the artist, it's the colors and the hues and the shades which they try and convey. And for the philosopher, or for the poet, it's the words and the rhymes and lyrics. And for the philosopher, it's the ideas and the words used to convey those ideas. And that is our art form, and that is how we express and how we absorb. And which is not to say that philosophers are philosophers to the exclusion of being artists and musicians, but I think that there's a natural tendency, and I don't just mean professional philosophers. I'm not a professional philosopher. There's nothing that makes me a philosopher more than anyone else here in this conversation that is interested in pursuing wisdom and interested in studying the thought that has gone into this, the adventure of ideas, as Alfred North Whitehead puts it, and it is an adventure in ideas. Ideas are those medium. They are our notes. They are our colors and hues. So as much as it's important to not be weighed down, like the Sufi carrying his books, not getting up the mountain, it's also important to know that ideas can elevate us, and they can uplift us, they can inspire us, they can inspire others, and ideas are powerful. There's nothing as powerful, says Victor Hugo, as an idea whose time has come. And it is upon us, upon those who love ideas, to use them for the greatest capacity and not, God forbid, for the negative.
Baruch, do you have anything to add?
Well, I had my own program. So I was busy with my own Zoom, giving a class with an artist. So I literally just tuned in now. I was waiting. I think I tuned in at the very end to get the punchline. The equals, like it says, the chassid who was an accountant working in the lumber industry, making all the calculations up and down, and he says, equals, what's the bottom total? Ein od milvade. There's nothing but the divine. So I hope that I came in the right time for the punchline that it's all one. Is it? Or is it more than one? I don't know.
I guess.
Or like the joke with the Buddhist pizza, right? I want one with, what did they tell the Dalai Lama?
Everything.
One with everything, yeah. Or in the Talmudic way, elu ve'elu, that they both even, point counterpoint, they're all one. Yes. Yeah, but so I did catch at the very end Gio saying that it seems like that you two are closer in alignment than in antagonism, right?
Well, my position is not settled anyway on the topic. The question of religious diversity, the question of religious pluralism. I have directions that I think are better than others. Like a deep religious pluralism is a better direction than sort of the old-fashioned perennialism. But what Zevi delivers is an enriched perennialism. Things become a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys want to take it, at some point there's a gentleman who's a rather caustic fellow who says that he wants to ask a question, but he knows will be thrown off the conversation. So I asked him to wait till the end, but whenever you guys want to take it, by all means.
Throw it out there.
Okay, so then go ahead. Ben, go ahead, please.
Zevi, what do you think?
I mean, if anyone has a question, that's going to be respectful and not going to seek to offend or put down anyone or incite any violence. I think we all have a right to free speech, and I'm happy to hear any question that's being raised.
Ben, if you have a disagreement or a challenge, by all means, share it.
it's this disagreement that goes back 1,000 years. It didn't start maybe 100 years. So all this nice talk about, different religions and the pantheon of believing in everything and everybody feeling comfortable and nice is just not the way I think and feel.
Would you like to?
I find it, as a matter of fact, sort of repulsive.
Strong word. Can you expand a little bit more on?
I mean, that's all there is to say to it. Discipline is acquired through the deep dives and concentration on particular points. It's not acquired through, as I said, pantheon of believing in everything and borrowing from everything for the sake of feeling good. It's just not the way I understand things.
Yeah, I don't know. We opened with a conversation about something called the Perennial Philosophy. I outlined what it was. I explained what my problems with it were. Zevi came back and gave his own version of it. So I don't think it was that dispersed, and there was a point.
No, but I have to say, I came at the very end. I'm just reacting to what Zevi said at the conclusion. I didn't hear what occurred before that. I was driving.
Thank you, Ben.
And it goes to Baruch as well. All the people who are dealing in New Age.
Well, at the same time, you tuned in, Ben. So thank you, knowing what you're getting into. So
I tuned in for the feeling of Fabregan, for the feeling of camaraderie, for the expectation of something new, for being with all of you who are wonderful people. But when I hear this New Age vibe, it's just like I'm allergic to it. I can't take 5 seconds of it.
Sure. What was the most New Agey part of it? What was the most?
It's like first of all, I know Baruch for decades, or at least decade and a half. So I know what Baruch thinks, but I just saw Zevi first time, and right away there's a mention of Shalomi and all that. I know where it's going.
Well, thank you for your honesty.
What do you mean honesty?
It
doesn't. I'm not a hero. Not like I'm coming up to the Red Square and declaring that I'm such a big dissident. I'm just saying like obvious things in the forum that essentially has no consequences for anyone. And here lies the problem, that there's no consequence for anyone.
Good. Ben, may I ask you, how do you perceive religion without the trappings of New Age-ism?
Yeah, but listen, I personally not so religious anymore, but so it's hard for me to answer that question honestly. But I think if you want to learn a discipline, you learn discipline to the fullest without any borrowings. And then you might change your mind and go to a different discipline, but like to be totally agnostic to, you eat meat, you're vegetarian, you essentially you consume everything. It's not what I accept. And then there is also the American cultural aspect to it, where everything is sort of get dumped down and cut in small digestible pieces that everybody likes to listen to and feels good about themselves, and then to go on about their lives. This the whole New Age shtick is American shtick.
Yeah, well, that
it's
was
like people go and sit in the middle of the room in those circles, whatever you do there, Baruch, and they wail some nice songs, and they light candles, and it's bullshit.
Yeah,
I mean, if you make money off that, Gesundheit, hate, all the power to you. I mean, if you make money of it, I mean, who am I to prevent anybody from making money? Nobody. Look, make your money. Make your money, but let's be honest about it. At the end of the day,
Ben, this doesn't sound like so much of a question as it is a critique of everybody around.
I warn you, I'm going to say something that will get me kicked.
No, but ask it.
But I apologize. I'm going to shut up right now because I don't want to hijack presentation by somebody else. It's after all, I came here at the end of the story and people spoke for a little while. Who am I to say things that I haven't even heard? It's like it's impolite. So I'm going to close my mic and wish everybody goodbye.
Well, I suppose we can include negative theology in the pantheon here. the theology of absence and critique. So thank you.
I would say, though, that of all my years in Chabad, I would say this, and it goes for you, Baruch. There's one question I always asked. When I grew up in the Soviet Union, it seemed to me that being a dissident is intrinsic part of being Jewish. Meaning, Jews that I saw around myself were rebels, counterculture people, intellectuals that risked everything and went against the grain. And then all of a sudden I found myself inside Chabad, and it was a total shock because I assumed the Jews are dissidents, and I haven't seen one dissident that went against the grain of the totalitarian thinking. Not only that, but even people who left Chabad, like you, Baruch, never really went against that grain, even after they threw out all the symbols of the religion, and sort of remained in the same quote-unquote business.
Yeah, there are very few, like the other Baruch Spinoza,
yeah,
that really stand up for their ideal. And but even Spinoza was needed religion for his own project and aim, even if it was, again, in a way as being a contrarian to religion. That in itself gave value on some level to the whole religious project. And yourself, you saying dissident, and as we know, a lot of there's the conviction thereof. Yeah, I agree with you that the more American liberal everything goes way of the 60s and what have you, and that's still percolating down to our day and age. It doesn't give enough definition and focus to whatever we do mean by the spirit and the transcendental.
Ben, is your main question a social question, or is it a theological or philosophical question?
It's not a question, it's a commentary. I know, I'm saying I'm allergic to things that Baruch says and things that, what's the name of that guy? Uri, whatever his name is, with the beard. What's your name, guy? Sir, what's your name?
What's my name? My name is
Yes.
Zevi. Nice to meet you.
Okay, I'm allergic to that kind of talk. So you tripped me on saying what I think about it.
You know, it's interesting. One of the charges that traditionalist kind of perennialists have against the perennialism of an Aldous Huxley or the kind of perennialism of an Alan Watts or what have you, is that they traditionalists felt that they were too hodgepodge, taking from there, here, whereas the traditionalists believed you needed the exoteric part of the religion too. You needed real initiation into a particular religious tradition, you know.
I agree with that view.
Hence, they were the traditionalists.
I don't know if you call it traditionals. I think in every discipline, I remember when I was taught, this person told me, you got to learn Tanya Baal Peh. And this, I don't know if Baruch is still here. He's the guy who was blessed.
Please explain what that means. That everybody knows what
you got to learn something, even if you're not fully into it, but you have to learn it by heart. So you take a text and you learn it, so it's a big vowel, and you learn it to a point when you can recite it. And then the fact of the ownership of this text, even though you might not understand or agree with it completely, the fact of the ownership of this text gives you a key to opening all other elements of this religion. So there's a word in English which I absolutely hate called deep dives. I hate that expression, but I am in the favor of a deep dive. In other words, you select a discipline and you master it completely. And that mastering of that discipline gives you a key to opening all other doors. And if you learn something superficially and you don't have mastery of one discipline completely, then you're lost.
Ben, despite your allergy to me, I happen to agree with you on this point. And maybe you'll say this as a final point. It's been about 2 hours, and I may have to head to another appointment soon. But I do believe that there's an incredible importance and value that cannot be overpassed, which is to dive into one's own religion, despite the dislike for the term itself, but to dig in one's own backyard. And I think particularly from that place of one's own particularism, in a very, very deep way, can we ever begin to explore the backyards of the other. I think that we need to be very deeply rooted within our own traditions. And I don't know if I can speak for Baruch and others in this group, but I could certainly rattle off many prakim of Tanya Balpeh on a dime for you. And it's something which I continue to be very deeply involved in. There is no mystic, past or present, who influences me as much as Lubavitcher Rebbe, my Rebbe, and his Torah continues to be the Torah which I live by, and a man who was an incredible dissident and a rebel in every sense of the word, who very deeply challenged.
I cannot disagree with this more, but it's all right.
Okay, you're welcome to disagree.
But by the way, listen,
but please let me finish. Let me finish what I was saying if I can, because I wasn't finished just yet.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I brought up this question. I had an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, who many of you may know. He ran a show called Thinking Aloud, which was later called New Thinking Aloud, and he interviewed really every spiritual giant and in fields of philosophy and parapsychology for the past 50 years or so. A great man in his own right, and also by association to the people that he's spent time with. And he himself, although he grew up Jewish, has become more secular over the years and took on a very open universalistic form of perennialism that really takes a bit from everywhere, a bit of a smorgasbord of religion, which people have some problem with. And I asked him during our interview, I said, Jeffrey, don't you believe, like the traditionalists and many others propose, that you really do need to put your feet very, very firmly in one ground, preferably your own ground, before you can make yourself a dilettante that has is a jack of all trades and master of none? And he answered something very interesting. And I still today don't know if I agree with him, and it's not the approach that I've taken in my own life. I still identify as a Hasidic Jew, and I don't identify as a universalist for reasons along these lines and others. He said something very interesting. He said that what is it that he's trying to get into? What is it that he's trying to find depth in? Is it the religion that he's trying to find depth in? Or is it God? Is it reality? Is it love? However it's going to be phrased. And he said that he's trying to get deep as deep as he can into God, into love, into reality itself. And he's not really interested in getting as deep as he can into Judaism or into Islam or into Christianity. I think this is something which is reflected by the great, great mystics of the traditions. Rumi says in a very beautiful verse of his that there comes a certain point where I'm no longer Muslim, no longer Christian, no longer Jew, where it's all just a place where the divine is manifest. And this may sound very New Age, but this is hundreds of years old. And the idea is that the be and end all of reality is not our religions. Our religions are constructs. They're man-made, and they're made so that we can go deep into God. And in Jeffrey Mishlov's in his own accounts, the way that he gets deep into God is by going into every single tradition, every place that he can find the divine. That may not be my path, it may not be your path, it may not be Baruch's or John's, but I certainly see the beauty and legitimacy in that path, and I want to defend a position which I don't particularly ascribe to myself.
Absolutely beautiful, as usual.
Zevi said that he has another engagement, so I just want to, before he goes, I want to thank Zevi, I want to thank Jonathan, I want to thank Omar. Thank you so much. It was really exciting, interesting experience, and something I hope that we all learn from.
I just want to say, thank you for organizing this. And I thank everyone here who really contributed to really, even when it got sharp or caustic or otherwise, everyone, I think it was a really, really productive discussion.
Yes, I'd like to second and third that. Thank you for all of you who are involved in hosting here. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Omar, for moderating. Thank you, everyone who came and joined the conversation and participated so wonderfully. Without you here to participate, it would be meaningless. And thank you to Jonathan, to my bar plukta, as we would say, to my person who I was able to lock heads and also I think lock hearts with in conversation and dialogue and debate. And I really do look forward to continuing this discussion and continuing to learn together. And thank you.
Zevi, not only are you very charismatic and very eloquent, but you're also like a walking library of knowledge of different mystical traditions. So, you're reminding me I have a lot to read, a lot more to read.
I feel the same when I read you, so it's mutual.
I came here, I wanted to see a fight. All I'm seeing, some kind of a sweet compliments to each other. What is this? It's some kind of a bullshit.
We've
I want to see a fight.
we've sublimated the fight.
Let's have a fight. Until next